was Martin Luther's "A Mighty Fortress is Our God." Really, I couldn't pick much of anything else on the day that we decided to discuss the Protestant Reformation. Luther, of course, is one of the major architects of the Protestant Reformation, and this is one of his original hymns, written for the German people and admittedly arranged in this particular case by, I think, Richard Wagner. At any rate, it's not representative of Renaissance and Reformation musical notes, but it is significant to notice that Protestantism brings with it a whole wide variety of hymnody in its own tradition, very separate from the Catholic tradition that we heard a little bit last time with the Gregorian chant, the Dies Irae, when we talked about Dante. Protestantism reforms a lot of things, and art and music will definitely change as a consequence. So with that in mind, let's jump on in. So today we are talking about the Renaissance and the Reformation, and in order to talk about the Renaissance and the Reformation, we have to do a good bit of background here. Most notably, we need to talk about probably the single most important factor in the sort of Renaissance intellectualism, the thing that is most associated with Renaissance and is the reason why it is called rebirth and not just, birth of modernism, namely it's Plato and Aristotle. Like, as we talked about a little bit with Dante, with the Reconquista of Spain and with more interaction between the Christian West and the Muslim South and East, and it's more traffic happening there, we finally have access to Plato and Aristotle in the original Greek. We have access to so many texts that have been lost in Western Europe for so long. And as a consequence, this brings about a whole explosion of scholarship, first in the 13th and 14th century when the texts are first starting to circulate, with the scholastics now engaged in the new sort of theology that brings more synthesis between the Platonic and Aristotelian writings, and even more so as we proceed into the 15th and 16th centuries, as the laymen are starting to get access to these texts as well, and starting to explore science for its own sake outside of the Christian church. But the other thing we definitely need to talk about is the historical situation. See, for the last 100 years or so, Europe has been in a giant mess. Throughout the 14th century, the papacy had been fractured. There had been this long period of time where the popes were all hanging out in Avignon in France rather than in Italy, and this was considered a major problem because the popes were starting to become the puppets of France instead of like an independent entity running the show in their own right. So because of this problem, the Italians elected their own darn pope in Rome at the same time as the Avignon papacy was going on, and now you have two popes. And to solve this, the cardinals all got together and they're like, hey, maybe we should just, throw out both of those popes and elect a new pope altogether. Then they did, and now you have three popes, one hanging out in the Roman Empire, one hanging out in Rome, one hanging out in Avignon, and for like 50, 60 years you have a succession of popes in each of these places, and there's just war and unrest and no religious organization. It's a giant freaking mess. And then it stopped. Like, there was another meeting of the cardinals. Everybody agreed to give up their power except that one asshole who, nobody cared about. He just, retired in exile. And it was over. Suddenly there was peace in Europe where for 100, 200 years there had been poverty and frustration and war. And all of a sudden that money that had been spent on war and frustration and all of that stuff can be spent on other things. Likewise, in Italy itself, which is a giant mess, there are all these duchies and little distinct entities that are all fighting against each other all the time. Famously, Milan and Venice and Florence were all fighting each other for control of northern Italy, and they too all signed a treaty right around the end of the 15th century, and everything was suddenly very quiet. So there was this weird lull in the entire scope of European history, where there had been conflict and suffering and pain and war before. All of a sudden, the most rich and powerful state of Italy all got together and quit fighting each other at the same time as all of Europe got together and quit fighting each other. And this brought about a time of surprising peace, prosperity, and stability, which allowed, again, all that money to be poured into other projects, things like science and art. The last thing we definitely need to talk about is the Holy Roman Empire. We're going to be focusing on the Holy Roman Empire quite a bit as it transforms throughout the modern period. You will see the Holy Roman Empire right smack in the middle of Europe here. It is the area to the east of France and to the west of Poland and Hungary. You probably know it today as Germany, but Germany doesn't exist right now, so get it out of your mind. No Germany. We do not have a Germany and will not have a Germany for another like 300 years. The Holy Roman Empire used to be sort of the crown jewel of Europe. It was founded by the papacy after the fall of Rome. It was meant to represent a new Rome, like governed by the Christian Catholic papacy. It was in a sort of uneasy relationship with it as time went on. But the way that the Holy Roman Empire worked is rather than having nations like France and Spain, it was a giant collective of a bunch of different competing interests, tiny little dukes and tiny little duchies and princes and kings and petty lords who all run their little bitty territory, and they all mostly coexist under the leadership, which is very loose, of the Holy Roman Emperor, first Charlemagne as decided by the papacy, and then passing it down, in usual bloodline fashion, from generation to generation. The Holy Roman Empire is at this point shrinking a lot. At this point, France and Spain and England are all starting to assert themselves as nations in their own right, where they had also once been fractured into a bunch of little tiny city-states and duchies and fiefdoms. Now they're sort of starting to see them as independent, united entities. At this point in history, England and France have been fighting each other for what is literally the 100 Years' War, and the other nations are also starting to sort of like identify more as the Spanish, or the French, or the Ottomans, or the Hungarians, than they are as just servants to a single lord in a single town or a single area. The Holy Roman Empire is shrinking, and it is increasingly evident that the Holy Roman Empire is not going to be able to stand in its current state. They are going to have to figure out what to do now that all of Europe is starting to modernize and change and become these national things, where the HRE really doesn't have that. Now, as it happens, this is going to get more complicated a little later on, but we'll get to that. And the last and perhaps most important factor in what is going to be the Renaissance is, of course, the printing press. I cannot overstate how important the printing press is to modern history. We talked a little bit last time about how, like, Plato and Aristotle had been reproduced, at least, the couple of texts that the Western Roman Empire had, from monastery to monastery. And that's because monasteries were the sole center of learning in Europe at this point. Like, I, again, cannot emphasize enough, they were the places where, monks were exchanging letters, everybody was literate, and they were, like, the only places where people were literate. The Catholic Church had basically like a block on literacy and education throughout the medieval period. Anyone who learned writing was probably learning it so they could either serve the Catholic Church or work with the Catholic Church. And with that in mind, that means Latin. Like, everybody was only speaking Latin. But it was also a painstakingly slow process. Remember, every parish in Christendom is supposed to have a Bible that the priest can read from in order to, serve the community, serve the parish. And just being able to make those Bibles by hand is a slow and painstaking process. You're talking about like dozens of monks for weeks on end just copying one text into another text. And of course, there's a lot of errors that can creep in this case. And in fact, the textual history of the Vulgate is riddled with these sorts of textual questions. And there are some pretty epic, like, scholarly mistakes that have made for some wild translation problems in history. It's not as prevalent as you think, but even so, it makes for some fun scholarship. My point, though, is that it takes a lot to make a book in this time. You're talking about weeks and weeks of work with multiple monks, or one monk working steadily for like months on end. And all it takes is for some goddamn cat to creep into the scribe room and pee all over your Bible, and now you're set back like weeks of work. And that happened. That totally happened. So it's a giant mess. And all of a sudden, this guy Gutenberg invents this printing press. It's not the first time the press has been invented. The Chinese have had the press for a while. But it's a press with movable type, which means that it's way more adaptable and it's way faster to change what the press is actually producing. And we go from you can produce a Bible like once every 4 months with a battery of monks working on it, to one dude being able to make 500 Bibles in 2 weeks. Like, this is a development on the order of the internet being invented, as far as just how easy it is to circulate information at this point in time. Like, this is a huge sea change. Being able to go from, I can get a book to you in 6 months to I can get 500 books to you by next Friday. Like, that's intense. And by the end of the Renaissance, the technology has been advanced and changed enough that, now we're talking about thousands of Bibles, thousands of books in a single week. Like, this is huge. Because it means that no longer do all these monasteries have to focus on just churning out Bibles for the parishes with the occasional, like, secondary project that the monks are working on. Now, it's easy to supply every parish in Europe with Bibles appropriate to the task. It is easy to, pick up some other text that you want to preserve, make 200 copies of it, and circulate it to every monastery in Europe. It's super easy. And what's more, it's cheap. Like, you don't have to pay the wages of all these monks for this long period of time. You don't have to, like, patronize or fund all of this. Instead, for a couple of, bucks, by contrast, like, hundreds still, but still way cheaper, you can get your notes, you can get your memoirs, you can get your scientific findings published. And that means that all of a sudden there are all these people all over Europe who are falling over themselves to publish what they find about science or art or whatever, and circulate it to everyone that they can. Literacy starts exploding as a consequence, because now people can afford books and there's actually a reason to get them. The whole of Europe changes as a consequence of this technological development. But let's focus first on art, because it's the Renaissance, and of course we're going to talk about Renaissance artwork, because it kind of is the flagship, discipline as far as that's concerned. Art is where the changes most obviously and most quickly take place. So this is Botticelli's Primavera. Primavera is the fancy Latin word for spring. And you'll notice that this is a mythic pagan depiction of spring, like the goddess of spring, all with their, togas and very Greek-looking attitudes. This is one of the first things that I want to emphasize about Renaissance art. Remember, up until this point, basically the only person who's paying for art in all of Europe is the Catholic Church. They've got all the money, they've got lots of reasons to do art, therefore they're the ones who are hiring all the artists to come do art for them. For the most part, this actually serves a really, practical purpose. Since 99% of Europeans are illiterate, by being able to make, fancy stained glass window pictures of Jesus ascending into heaven or the crucifixion, that's a real quick and dirty way to teach the gospel without anyone having to learn to read. So altarpieces and stained glass windows and statues, these are all very important to how the Catholics communicate the gospel. But now that it's the Renaissance and now that everything is peaceful, there are all these secular folks wandering around who have enough money to tell an artist to make a painting for them. So we are increasingly more interested in other non-Catholic art. And you'll notice, since this is very clearly some pagan artwork there, that the Renaissance, because of the reintroduction of Plato and Aristotle and the great Greek poets and writers, there's a lot of people who are interested in pagan themes and mythic art. So here you have the Primavera. Let's demonstrate what spring is. The other thing that you will notice, especially in The Birth of Venus by Botticelli, is there's a renewed focus on the realism of the human form and the beauty of the human form. If it shocks you that this could be, made in this 15th century, this should definitely shock you. Prior to this, the medieval period had produced many, many works that, depicted Mary or depicted Jesus or depicted various major biblical figures, but it was almost always unrealistic, as we'll talk about in a little bit. And it was always, always decorous. The Catholic Church, as we stressed when we were talking about Dante, does not have truck with nudity or romantic sex or anything like that. These are temptations at best and mortal sins at worst. But increasingly in the Renaissance, again, due to this new patronage, due to this renewed interest in pagan philosophy and mythic literature, now there is a renewed interest in the human form as well. A lot of people have been discovering all those old ancient Greek statues that are naked, and they're they really respected and revered the human form. We should do the same. Because everybody respects all those pagans, because there's this weird sort of disconnect between, they aren't saved, but they're also awesome. More and more people are sort of emulating the pagans in their architecture and their art and other ones. Hence, The Birth of Venus. Now, one of the other things that you'll notice about Renaissance art and architecture is it is a huge departure from the art and architecture of the past. So this is the Rheims Cathedral in Rheims, France, and it is a quintessential example of late Gothic architecture. You can see that it's got all these little fiddly details. There's all these tiny little spires. There's statues on the door frames, and there's all this weird lace work on the stained glass windows, and these really thin windows. And you'll notice that everything points up. Every single line of this entire building is pointing up into the sky, and it's just all this clear evidence that you should not be focusing on the building. Instead, you should be focusing on God. Every line is calculated to do that in this cathedral. And the complexity of it just further emphasizes, this is a building that is supposed to represent the long and involved history of God's interactions with humans on Earth. But this focus on complexity, the scholastic sort of interest in, theology personified in stone, very much gives way in the Renaissance to a renewed interest in simplicity. You'll notice all of that little filigree work, all of those complex little spires and stuff are gone when you look at typical Renaissance architecture. And the cathedral at Rheims, here we have another chapel, but a small one, a relatively modest one, created by Brunelleschi, the same guy who came up with that fancy way of doing realistic artwork and understanding linear perspective in the video. And notice even on the inside it's the same thing. Each of the major Gothic cathedrals usually had equally complicated interiors with lots of wings and lots of little alcoves to put icons and statuary, lots of places that would again remind you of all the theology and all of the stories and all of the biblical literature that has gone into God's legacy. Here, on the other hand, you can see there are still a couple of alcoves, but they're small, out of the way, and they're very simple, very straightforward. All of the Renaissance uses these easy lines, these easy curves. They've got these barrel vaults. that are very typical of Greek and Roman architecture. This is a return to the old pagan styles in both the architecture and the art. Um, You'll also see that the Renaissance artists and architects are more interested in science and technology than many decades past. So this is the Florence Cathedral dome, and this one comes with a bit of a story. Famously, they had created the cathedral, like, again, in this sort of quasi-simple Renaissance architecture style, and then they made this big giant gap, this big like octagonal center chapel, only they didn't have the technology to actually build a dome to cover it. So when they went to build the dome, it fell in. And they hired some other architect to do it, and it also collapsed. And it's like destroying half the building while they do it. Finally, they hire Brunelleschi, and Brunelleschi literally designs this new chapel, or this new chapel dome, with all of the principles that he's picked up along the way. It's got a double skeletal structure. It has this big weight at the top that actually compresses the whole dome and causes the whole thing to be more stable, as, you know, unintuitive as that may sound. Brunelleschi is very interested in the actual physics involved in architecture, rather than just sort of copying the strategies pioneered by the masters. And that isn't to say that like the old Gothic cathedrals aren't themselves like masterpieces of, you know, physics and leverage in their own right. But Brunelleschi is pushing the boundaries. He is taking it in new directions. He is himself pioneering new architectural and artistic techniques. And because he is a prolific writer and because the printing press is around, he can publish his findings and spread them. Now everyone knows how he made the dome in Florence. Now everyone understands linear perspective. And you can see this interest in science and technology and sort of like the way that, you know, art works throughout the Renaissance as well. So here, of course, is the famous painting, The Last Supper by Da Vinci, which, again, you should have watched a video about. And you'll notice that linear perspective is very much a huge part of how this painting works. You can see that every line in this work meets at this central point behind Jesus' head, at the window that sort of illuminates his head. You can see that, like, the focal point always draws you in to the head of Jesus. That everything about this painting points toward it. This was a sort of acknowledgement by the Renaissance artists, this sort of recognition that they could control the way that your eye moved, that in addition to sort of recognizing like how they could render a 3D space on a 2D canvas or other materials, they could also sort of recognize the psychology involved, see how people see a painting, and they could share that information and pass it from person to person. So you can see that a lot of this painting, The Last Supper, has a lot of medieval like flourishes to it. You can see that all the apostles have the halos, as is typical. You can see like a lot of emphasis on the different expressions, and you can see a lot of the symbolism at play here. You can see a lot of the sort of like two-dimensional rendering. A lot of these apostles are in profile, but that also all serves the central focus. Every single one of them is looking at Jesus, except that guy and that guy. But that's another matter. Meanwhile, Jesus, who is usually represented in medieval artwork with this huge halo that like usually says like in the name of God or something equally, you know, impressive, now his halo is virtually invisible. Like you can see just a couple of lines there, and they might not even have been in the original text. But instead, the halo is made by the natural positioning of the door behind his head. Now they're using naturalistic techniques to achieve the same things that they accomplished with medieval, you know, symbolism. The Renaissance is very interested in doing that and trying to make things more naturalistic, more realistic, less two-dimensional, less symbolic, and instead more natural, more the way that we see the world. You can also see the way that they employ science and this sort of naturalism in the way that they use old Greek and Roman techniques like the golden ratio. Because they now have a greater command of math, because now that, you know, Euclid's principles and all of the known Greek knowledge about art and literature are becoming more accessible, artists like Da Vinci are employing these techniques to sort of inform their works, make them more classical in that sense. And Da Vinci especially is all over this stuff. Like, Da Vinci was absolutely one part scientist, one part artist. He was always trying to push the boundaries of what art and science could do. He was very interested in the world around him. But let's talk more about this whole, humanism, realism thing. So this is a pretty typical example of how the medieval world would have portrayed one of their most important subjects, namely the Madonna and Child. This is Mary, portrayed in her typical blue robe, and here is Jesus in his little orange robe with his master's stick and making his gesture with the two fingers. It's like, yes, what I am saying is true. Notice that they've both got the big halos that I said before, but also notice that this is very much flat. There is no interest in portraying a three-dimensional space the way that the Renaissance artists are repeatedly interested in portraying it. There is not even any interest in portraying realism. Like, Mary's hand looks like it belongs to a friggin' alien here. Like, it's just weird. And what's with the expression? But this was actually intentional on the part of the medieval artists. They didn't want to portray realistic figures. They were trying not to portray Mary and Jesus as though they were actual people, which could, detract from the message they're trying to get across. Instead, they're trying to portray them as icons, as symbols. You're not supposed to admire the painting. You were supposed to let the painting guide you to thinking about bigger, more holy, more mystical, and metaphysical ideas. You're supposed to look at this painting and think, oh yeah, Mary and Jesus, and then think not about the painting, but actual Mary and Jesus. This is a focal point for praying, not like an actual thing to pray to. But you'll notice that this is gradually changing. So in the 15th century, we have here another Virgin and Child with, again, the same color scheme, the blue on Mary's gown here, and the red for the angels that are hanging around. And this is really striking. Like, obviously, it has way more sense of actual place here. There's much more of an effort to make a sort of three-dimensional effect here in the early Renaissance. You'll also see Mary is weirdly disrobed. So again, you've got that focus on sort of human beauty, but she also still looks like an alien. Like, that's definitely not how boobs work. You can also see that Jesus is portrayed naked here, but there has been a determined effort to make him a three-dimensional baby-looking thing. He's still a little alien-ish. Like, what are you going to do? And again, this is probably because it is still meant to be sort of strange and discomforting. You're supposed to look beyond this. But now there's more artistic flourishes, more effort to sort of make the art stand out in its own right. But by contrast, look at the small cowper Madonna of Raphael. Again, we have the same blue-red color scheme, especially on Mary's outfit, but look at how natural she looks by contrast. Like, these are just people. Like, this is what people look like. Mary and Jesus are not being presented as, just flat icons to point you towards actual praying, or weird alien monsters with, like, unnatural human pigmentation. Like, these are warm, living, breathing, blood-filled human beings. You can see that even their expressions are gentle and peaceful and tranquil, rather than sort of like alien or staring directly at the viewer the way that Berlinguero's painting works. This too is very typical of the Renaissance. You'll also notice that they're situated in this sort of like hilly countryside. This is also very typical of the Renaissance. Like, the Renaissance artists wanted to emphasize that Jesus and Mary and the whole like biblical story could have happened anywhere. So rather than, specifically go out of their way to paint legitimate like Palestinian countryside, they just imported their own Italian countryside and stuck it right in the background of the painting like it's no big deal. The emphasis again is these are real people. These are people who could have been your neighbors. This story is not some highfalutin thing that happened thousands of years ago and was like in this more important time where men were men and women were women and sons of God were sons of God. No, like, these were actual people, like any person who you know, who you meet at the store or who you bump into on the road. That's very much what they're trying to emphasize here. So notice again this theme as it is portrayed by other artists at other times. So here we have the Virgin on the Rocks of Da Vinci in 1483 and the Alba Madonna of Raphael. And you can see, again, there's all of this humanism, all of this location in a space familiar to us, although Da Vinci's is admittedly considerably stranger, what with the whole cave thing. But you can also see, again, this sort of moving back and forth between the old form and the new. You can see the very same traditions at play. You can see Mary looking down on baby Jesus, and you can see Mary looking down on baby Jesus. The tradition, the subject has not changed, but the portrayal is very different. So here we have, shocker, a Trinitarian way of looking at the entire Mary-Jesus relationship. Notice how in each case there are three major figures, four technically in the Virgin of the Rocks, but who cares what she is? Mostly they're just connected to John the Baptist. And three over here. And notice that they've formed this natural triangle shape in both cases. This implies this sort of balance and order of the universe, the same way that Dante implied balance and order in the universe in all of his, careful numerology in his cantos and his heaven, hell, and purgatory. You can also see, especially in Da Vinci's case, a renewed interest in science and the world around them. Like, notice all of the detail that Da Vinci has put on all of the plants and the way that the reflections work. Like, Da Vinci, of course, is always interested in this stuff. He is very interested in portraying a scientifically reliable environment. Likewise, Raphael, just like he always does, places his Mary and Jesus right in the middle of the Italian countryside with all the plants and critters and stuff that you would expect there. But also notice the way that the dynamic between the characters move. Like in the other paintings in the Renaissance, following eye lines leads you all over the place. So where the Last Supper is like everybody focusing on Jesus' central head, here your eye is trained to move. When you look at Mary's face in the Virgin on the Rocks, you're led by that and by her hand to John the Baptist. And John the Baptist and his mother are both pointing at Jesus, who is himself praying, which leads you back up to Mary, putting your eye in this sort of natural triangular motion, again, following the three persons of the Trinity. Mary as representative of God, Jesus as, of course, Jesus, and John the Baptist as representative of the Holy Spirit. Likewise, here in Raphael, the focus is all one thing for the most part. Both Mary and John the Baptist are staring up at the cross. Well, isn't it convenient that Jesus just happens to be holding a cross? So while Jesus is himself looking at John the Baptist, you can see that your eye is almost guaranteed to eventually make its way up to the cross. This is a moment in Jesus' early life, but Raphael is specifically pointing us to the end of Jesus' life, recognizing not just why or that Jesus is here, but why Jesus has come. Now, the last thing I want to stress about all of this is, again, like the pose that is in place for all of these Renaissance artists. You will notice that most of the characters that the Renaissance artists are portraying are relaxed. They are peaceful, tranquil. The Renaissance artists are usually interested in painting biblical themes and biblical pictures and themes across the board as though they're eternal, that they're sort of like stopped in time, that the moments that you see from Da Vinci or Raphael, they could have happened at any time, they are still happening today, it's like they're perpetually happening. And you can notice this in the way that the David is being presented in these three statues here. So in Donatello's David, you can see, again, that very easy pose. Here is David standing on the decapitated head of Goliath, and he is just super chill about it. Like, no big deal. Bring me another Goliath. I'll take him out too. No problem. It's even easier when Michelangelo sculpts David here. Like, you can see him just jauntily holding his sling over his shoulder. Like the Donatello David, you can see that his legs are positioned so all of his weight is on the one foot. This is what's known as the contrapposto position, and it is very popular in Renaissance artwork. You will see a lot of characters depicted either in statues or in paintings as like this easy, relaxed position. And notice too that Michelangelo spends a lot of time on realistic musculature for David, as well as his anatomical details. But notice how this is a huge contrast with how Bernini portrays David in the 17th century. Like Bernini, his David is in this violent motion. He is in the act of swinging his sling. He is off balance, and it almost looks like the statue might fall over at any moment. Where the David of Michelangelo and the David of Donatello are sort of like totally outside of time in this completely peaceful, eternal pose, Bernini captures an instant, a moment, between two other moments. It is coming quickly and going quickly. It will not last. But we'll talk about that more when we get to Baroque art next time. We have one of these PowerPoint presentations. But the last thing I want to talk about is the funding. As much as there is a lot of secular money floating around and a lot of rich businessmen and tradesmen who are now able to fund art, naturally it's still the Catholic Church that's footing most of the bills. And we cannot talk about like the Catholic Church's patronage without talking about the most important work of Renaissance patronage in the Renaissance, namely the Sistine Chapel. The Sistine Chapel was meant to replace the old Petrine Chapel that the popes had been using for hundreds of years. It was going to be bigger, it was going to be better, it was way more expensive than anything that had come before. The popes definitely pulled out all the stops when it came to funding this chapel, and they got all the best artists of the time to work on it. So a couple of the things that I definitely want to talk about. Here is Perugino's Christ giving the keys of the kingdom to St. Peter, and notice that this is super Catholic, like super duper Catholic. Notice that we still have the linear perspective at play with all the tiles in the yard here, much like Da Vinci will do later with the Last Supper. But notice the way that it's emphasized. Here we have all the disciples milling around, but notice that what we are depicting in the central position is Jesus handing the keys to Peter, like we talked about in the Dante lecture. This is the moment that Peter is entrusted with the whole of the earthly, heavenly realm. Like everything that Jesus has established on earth, Peter will then inherit, and whatever Peter looses on earth will be loosed in heaven and vice versa. But notice too, in the background, we've got this giant, typically Renaissance chapel or cathedral dwarfing these two arches on either side. Once again, emphasizing that the church is much more powerful and significant than any of these secular forces, political or economic or otherwise. The church stands triumphant in this scene. It's not subtle. One of the other things that we should definitely talk about is the ceiling, of course. This is Michelangelo's masterpiece, that just runs the entire length of the Sistine Chapel ceiling. And of course, we have to talk about this panel. All of the scenes on the ceiling represent major moments in Genesis. Like Michelangelo was specifically painting, all of these important episodes in the creation of the world and, the subsequent events leading up to Noah and the flood. And of course, this one is the actual creation of man. And notice the way that Michelangelo portrays it. Again, we've got these natural, easy poses, especially on Adam's part, although God is, reaching really hard and all the angels are struggling to sort of keep him in his little, I don't even know, ribbon boat thing. Whatever. You can see, again, Michelangelo is emphasizing the musculature, emphasizing the way that bodies physically exist in a space. But also notice the theology that he is teaching here. Adam is sitting here all lackadaisical, I guess I'll reach out to you, God. He's not even fully extending his arm. He's just sort of relaxed, reclined on the rock. Obviously, they could touch if he would just, friggin' get up. But he won't. But meanwhile, here's God straining every muscle, trying to get him with the one finger, being held in his place by all of the angels. The entire force of God is reaching out to man, and Adam, can't even be bothered. Um, Notice how this very much depicts the whole gospel message in a single painting. Here is Adam, the sinner, indifferently chilling, while God stretches out, reaching desperately for Adam, and they barely miss. There is, in fact, space between God's finger and Adam's hand. And that depiction, the fact that they're both looking at that space, at that little tiny gap between their fingers, is another emphasis on the importance of Jesus. Just like all of the characters in Raphael's Alba Madonna staring at the cross, here we have both God and Adam looking at that space and thinking, man, if only someone would show up and link our fingers. If only Jesus were here to make the bridge that we cannot achieve. So again, Michelangelo is communicating more than just, dudes are hot, although I'm sure that that was also a part of it. It is largely suggested that Michelangelo was gay, but, that's a conversation that I am ill-equipped to have, I'm afraid. The last thing that I definitely want to talk about is the Last Judgment. This represents a completely different moment in Michelangelo's career. You'll notice that the Sistine Chapel was mostly constructed in like the late 15th century and early 16th century. But the Last Judgment was made considerably afterwards in 1541. And you'll notice that it has a completely different aesthetic than we are used to from the Renaissance. It is busy, where Renaissance artwork tends to be simple. It is abstracted in a way that Renaissance artwork is typically grounded in reality. It is active. There are all these people in motion, frequently violent motion, like the people carrying people off of the earth or throwing them into the boat. This is largely because Michelangelo suffered some pretty serious trauma between his creation of the Sistine Chapel ceiling and this particular painting of the Last Judgment. This sort of accompanies a change across the board in the way that art worked. The typical Renaissance values had been overturned in favor of these new manneristic ones. And a lot of the reason is because Michelangelo watched Rome get sacked in the intervening years, which we'll talk about momentarily. But what we're basically talking about here is, of course, the Protestant Reformation. So let's just jump right into this. So here is Martin Luther as painted by Lucas Cranach the Elder, and Luther is absolutely the guy who kicks all of this off. Now, there had been sort of rumblings for a while at this point that people were getting discontent with the Catholic Church. You'll remember when we started this lecture, I mentioned how all of that political infighting between those weird three popes had caused all of Europe to sort of fall into chaos. Between that and the Avignon papacy across the board, people were getting real sick and tired of the popes telling them what to do when the popes can't even figure out how to, tie their own shoes at this point. And what's worse, the Catholics are getting more and more, shall we say, indulgent with their corruption and their interest in profit. Specifically, there was this practice called selling of indulgences, where the Catholics would say, hey, we will totally give you bonus treatment in purgatory and fast track you to heaven if you pay us a nominal fee and, maybe grease a couple of palms in the process. After all, we're building this fancy new chapel and we've got Michelangelo to paint the ceiling. Why don't you pitch in and we'll grant you a seat in heaven? And anyone who actually knew how Christian theology works, like Martin Luther, who is just a punk monk in Germany at this point in time, is rather disgusted by this practice. Since when should the church be this interested in filthy lucre, in money? Since when does salvation depend on whether or not you're willing to, make a nominal donation to the Catholic Church? That's not cool. That's not right. This is a disgusting abuse of biblical teaching and Christian theology. So Martin Luther, in his typical very level-headed fashion, makes 95 theses, nails them to the door of the Württemberg monastery, and then sets basically the entire world on fire. I suspect to some degree Luther didn't have in mind that he wanted to blow up all of Catholicism when he wrote his 95 Theses. He mostly just had a couple of grievances that he needed to air and thought that this might warrant some reform. But it snowballed quickly. A lot of people started jumping on board with this idea that the Catholics had gotten too big for their britches, and all of these churches across Germany, especially, or the Holy Roman Empire at this point, are jumping ship and saying, "Hey, why bother to pay, tithes to the Catholic Church when I could just keep my own land and worship whatever Luther's talking about?" And so the Protestant Reformation begins. What's more, other folks start jumping on board with this and creating their own Protestant theologies. So John Calvin creates the Reformed Church. He has his own set of theological principles, his own ideas. So he is very, very much founds his own sort of theological system, which is commonly known as Calvinism. Unlike Luther, who was basically just like, hey, Catholicism is like 95% okay, but we got to fix the problems that it has. Calvin was basically like, nope, Catholics are the worst, and the Pope is the Antichrist, and if we just destroy Catholicism entirely, then everyone will be way better off. And people apparently like hearing this as well, so Calvinism also spreads, especially through like the Netherlands and up into Scotland and then into England as well. Between these two forces, you've got a whole bunch of people jumping ship from the Catholic Church. But Calvin's got a couple of other tricks that we kind of need to be attentive to, and which will become more important as history proceeds on. Specifically, Calvin is really pessimistic about like human goodness. Like you'll remember that we said in the Dante lecture that the sort of Orthodox Christianity stressed that like everybody is sinful and bad, but Dante himself is saying that like, well, Socrates gets to hang out in the good part of hell because he wasn't that bad. Calvin's more on the other side. He's like, nope, everyone is the worst, and the only way that any of them can become even a little bit good is if they believe in Jesus and if Jesus makes them good. Calvin is very suspicious of the whole freedom part and the freedom and election divide. He absolutely emphasizes more that God is the only person who is like active in the business of salvation. But as a sort of like minor note in his theology, he also mentions that one good sign of being blessed by God was having a big fat bank account. And while this may not seem like a big deal, it becomes one and very much justifies a lot of Christian entrepreneurship in the centuries down the road. So we'll come back to that. On the bright side, both Luther and Calvin do in fact believe what they're trying to teach. Like they both have their theological systems. They both have done a whole lot of research. They both are insisting that we should go back to the Bible for Christianity instead of trusting whatever the church says. They are, in a sense, true believers, even if a whole bunch of people sort of like latch onto them with slightly less than good motives. But perhaps the best example of let's be a Protestant because of selfish reasons is, of course, Henry VIII. Henry VIII was the King of England, and he was kind of a jerk. He had, at this point, married a woman, and then she didn't make him any male heirs, and he got sick and tired of waiting, so he just killed her, and then got a new wife because you can't divorce people in Catholicism. That's not acceptable, especially for a king. So he's got this new wife, and she's also kind of the worst. She's definitely not producing any male heirs, but what's worse is Henry can't just off her because she was a political marriage, and there are going to be all these nations who are really mad if he starts, like killing their family members. So he petitions the Pope for a divorce, and the Pope's kind of busy at the moment, what with Rome being sacked by Charles V and his army. So Henry VIII is like, you know what, screw it, I'll make my own religion, and I can make my own divorces, and I'll do whatever I want because I'm the king and I'll be the Pope. So he does. He makes his own religion. He calls it Anglicanism because he's English, so it's the English religion. And he gets however many divorces he wants, and he marries somebody else, and finally has a male heir. And hooray for Henry VIII, the biggest asshole in the history of Renaissance kingship. But as you'll notice, this has gotten rather out of hand. And it kind of makes sense that it's gotten out of hand. Like, the whole principle that Luther was banging on about when he was originally, questioning the Catholic Church, he was saying, why don't we just read our own dang Bibles and come to our own dang conclusions? Which, is possible now. Like, the because of the printing press, the Reformation not only like spreads like wildfire. All of these guys publish their works, and they spread all over the Holy Roman Empire and all over Europe. But it also means that people can, in fact, like pick up a Bible and read it, or at least more people than used to. Like the literacy rate is definitely not high. We're talking about it being at like 10% at this point, but it's still way higher than the 1% it was 150 years ago. So all of a sudden, there are all these people who, in fact, can read their Bibles. There are all these people who, can actually spend the money and spend the effort to learn how to read, and thus make their own conclusions about theology. But when you tell people to read the Bible and come to their own conclusions about theology, naturally disagreements arise. Which is why Protestantism becomes this giant freaking mess within a matter of 100 years. Now, this chart, admittedly, is not just like the 16th century. You'll notice that we've got like the Adventists and the Southern Baptist Convention, and the old Catholic churches, and like new changes all the way up to the 20th century and beyond. But this is kind of the pattern of Protestantism. Catholicism had always emphasized we are one universal church. That's what Catholic means. We are all part of the same belief in Jesus. We all believe in Jesus, therefore we are all one Catholic church. The Protestants, on the other hand, are perfectly happy to just divide and divide and divide and divide. So after Martin Luther founds Protestantism and founds Lutheranism branches off into the Episcopalians and the charismatic churches and the Methodists and Congregationalists and all of this mess. And we've got like the Anglicans further causing craziness and messiness all over the place. Meanwhile, you've got the Reformed Church and its traditions down here. The Reformed Church gives way to Presbyterianism and the Church of Scotland, but Protestants, by way of Calvin, also found the Anabaptist movement, who then go on to be like the Amish folks. Whether or not Baptist churches are actually connected to Anabaptists is another question that you're going to have to take up with somebody who knows more about it. But honestly, everybody is very much in disagreement about where their inspirations come from. At any rate, suffice it to say, there's a giant mess of denominations because the fundamental tenet of Protestantism is go read your own dang Bible, and when people do, they disagree about what they find there. Catholicism has, for the most part, remained pretty unified in this time, though. And in fact, by being threatened by Protestantism, the Catholics start to flinch. So this is St. Ignatius of Loyola, who is the founder and leader of the Jesuit movement. Now, the Catholics know how to deal with heresies. They've dealt with a bunch of heresies in the past. We talked a little bit about Albigensians that time, and they were just one in a long line of heresies that the Catholics have put down. And the way that you deal with heresies for the Catholics is you make a new monastic order, and then you send out the monastic order to circulate information and pamphlets and books and all sorts of things that debunk the heresy, as well as killing off heretics when they get the chance. So, because this is just another heresy, the Catholics raise up another order to combat the Protestants. In this case, they take St. Ignatius and they say, all right, you are now in charge of the Jesuit movement. Go and exterminate the Protestants. This does not work, at all. At all. Protestantism, because of the printing press, because of the various lords and kings who are keen to get out from under the Catholic Church's tithing system, they basically just run wild with it. And meanwhile, the Jesuits are like, hey, we have all of these books about why Protestantism is wrong. And kings are like, we will attack you if you do not, just shut up and leave us alone. So while Ignatius is a really big deal in Catholic circles, and the Jesuits will become a really powerful arm of the Catholic Church, most school systems and universities that we are familiar with, especially in the States, fall into Jesuit hands. Boston College, my alma mater, is a huge Jesuit school. Pretty sure Notre Dame is as well. Jesuits become famous for their scholarship and their learning and their theology, but they're not especially famous for beating the crap out of Protestants the way that good old Saint Nick was once upon a time, beating up Arians. So the Counter-Reformation is a big deal, and Catholicism is going to circle the wagons and try to fight Protestants in a variety of ways, but it's not going to succeed all that much. And ultimately, this is going to devolve into a lot of fighting and a lot of warfare. Not just, Charles V sacking Rome on a lark because, screw the Pope, but eventually we're going to get into the 30 Years' War, which is absolutely going to gut the Holy Roman Empire and Central Europe in general. It's going to be a huge mess, and it's going to leave Europe wounded and in stitches for quite a while. But we should definitely talk about exactly what the landscape is as far as that's concerned. So as a recap, again, the Lutherans have spread at this point throughout a lot of the Holy Roman Empire and all the way up into Scandinavia. The Calvinists have taken over Denmark and the Netherlands in large part, or at least the Netherlands by the 17th century. They are spreading throughout the Holy Roman Empire and get a real foothold in Scotland. Hooray for the Reformed Church, giving way to those Presbyterians. Catholicism is still strong in Spain, in Italy, and in France. Shocker there, because that was very much the Catholic stronghold originally. But you'll notice that there are Protestant minorities in a lot of France, and especially in Eastern Europe, like Poland and Hungary and so on and so forth. They are still, for the most part, Catholic, but Protestantism is sinking in, and it's becoming more and more powerful by the day. But this also radically changes the way art works. As Europe is suffering through all of this turmoil and disagreement, disunited under different churches rather than the common church that they've followed for, centuries at this point, art responds in kind. So here is Michelangelo's Pieta before the Protestant Reformation, before Europe was all broken up, and it has all of the typical hallmarks of typical Michelangelo Renaissance art. You've got your realistic, carefully articulated figures, you've got the simple, easy poses, you've got, all the religious significance of the Pieta, like Jesus lying across Mary's lap after his death, after he has been removed from the cross, and Mary, trying to cope with this death, but, again, in this sort of eternal, peaceful, tranquil, easygoing way. And then contrast this with his same subject, his Pieta of 1555, and you can see how radically his perspective has shifted. Where the earlier Pieta was easy and tranquil and calm and eternal, here we have all of these figures struggling with the dead body of Christ. Here the emphasis is not on the tranquility, the sort of all in God's plan easiness of the situation, but rather how much struggle, how much pain and suffering is involved in dealing with this awful truth, in dealing with the weight of sinfulness. But notice that Michelangelo is taking some artistic liberties here. He is not even trying to represent the characters as realistic, naturalistic individuals. Jesus is twice as big as all of the other characters, even though the two women are on their knees. It just doesn't seem realistic. He's just huge and flopped all over the place and unnaturally contorted in their hands. Notice that even the faces and stuff are more simplistic than we're used to seeing from Renaissance artwork. It's definitely not a peaceful scene. This is more like Bernini's David, in the moment, active and possibly even violent. This is going to be typical of this new art movement that is developing. In this case, Mannerism. And you'll notice a lot of these sort of characteristic traits throughout a lot of Manneristic artwork. So here we have Perigiano's Madonna with the long neck, and notice how many strange choices have been made in this particular depiction. This is supposed to be, again, it's a Madonna scene. This is like the album Madonna of Raphael, all those peaceful Madonnas hanging out with their baby Jesuses. But notice how Perigiano, I'm going to never get that one right, how he is depicting the baby Jesus not just as a baby, but almost corpse-like. His eyes are closed, his body is naked and deformed and distorted. It's way bigger than you would expect any baby to be, so it looks more like the Pieta. Notice that he's sort of conflating the two depictions here. Mary is looking at her beautiful baby boy, but her beautiful baby boy is dead in her hands. He is foregone, in the whole divine plan. He is bound to be dead. He is basically drawing attention to the echo between the Madonna with her child and the Pieta after his death. But also notice just how weird the dimensions are. Like, never mind the fact that Jesus looks like an alien again. Notice that, like, she's got this weird giraffe neck thing that's like craned as she's looking down on him, and she's got like this hugely long body. Like, she must be like 12 feet tall in this picture, like, especially compared to the women standing next to her who are all, normally sized. But she's literally standing on the ground while seated somehow, and still like 3 feet taller than all of them. Like, what even is that? And then you look at that column in the back. Like, where the hell did that column come from? What even is happening in this painting? Parisian Giannino doesn't care. One of the hallmarks of Mannerism is they're no longer interested in that Renaissance ideal of like naturalistic, realistic depiction. The Mannerists are totally okay with distorting space, distorting bodies, changing around the realistic conventions of the Renaissance in order to support whatever message they're trying to communicate. It works. Like, this is an effective painting. It is effective in the sense that it is emotionally compelling, that it makes you think about the relationship between Mary and Jesus throughout the duration of Jesus' life. Even if we've got this weird dude at the bottom who's like, is he brushing the column? No, he's like unraveling a scroll in front of the column, but he's apparently like 6 inches tall compared to does it even matter? He doesn't matter. Like, the whole focus of the painting is here. And while there is this guy who's apparently like heraldry announcing something, he's firmly resolved to the background. He has this secondary role, and as a result, he's significantly smaller. That's okay for the Mannerists. The other thing you'll notice about Mannerist painting is where the Renaissance backgrounds tended to be tranquil and peaceful, where everything was simple and calm, Mannerism tends to be a lot more busy. So, like, you can see this is the Finding of Moses by Tintoretto. Here is baby Moses being put into the basket so he can be, like, pushed down the stream and protected from Pharaoh's agents going around killing all the babies in Israel. And you can see, like, here are all of Pharaoh's agents with their hunting dogs and their bows and arrows, and they're, like, chasing after these people who are trying to hide their babies. Tintoretto is depicting, Moses being protected by depicting the violence surrounding all of these characters. And notice, too, that everything is a lot blurrier. Like, the trees are depicted as more, almost icons of trees than actual trees. The plants are sort of hinted at, but they're fuzzy, they're indistinct. Where Leonardo da Vinci would have, like, painstakingly made sure that every plant accurately represented, like, proper Italian foliage in the cave that he is depicted. This is less important to the Mannerists. The Mannerists are interested in depicting the emotional value of the scene, not necessarily like the eternal calmness of the scene, the role it plays in God's divine plan. You can also see that they are way more interested in darkness and light. So here we have Moses drawing water from the rock, and one of the major things that you will notice that differs wildly between Renaissance art and Mannerist art. Renaissance art is almost always lit in this like flat, even lighting, as though like they've got, giant spotlights hanging out behind them. The way that like when you go to take a family picture, they've got the big umbrella things. It seems like the Renaissance artists have an infinite supply of those, and they're always drawing everybody as though they're always lit from above and in front. Whereas Tintoretto and the Mannerists will draw light in all kinds of weird ways. So here in Moses drawing water from the rock, you can see the light is actually behind Moses, and it causes all of these violent shadows. So while Moses is pretty well lit, you can see that even like God up here is sort of half in shadow, half in light. He's engaged in the judgment of Moses because Moses said that he was going to draw the water from the rock instead of God drawing the water from the rock. You can see all these people fighting for place in the water, and they're all twisted in these violent positions, and most of them are also like primarily in shadow. Like, you can't see anybody's face clearly in here except for Moses and this dude. I don't know why that dude, or that woman. I guess she's got a baby, so she must be a woman. All of the others are obscured. We've got this dude's random face and shadow. We got this dude turning away. God is almost completely obscured by his shoulder. We got this random cow. Like the cow, you can see pretty clearly. But again, like everything about the cow is covered except for the face. Tintoretto is showing us that like not everything is clean and easy, because this is after the Protestant Reformation. Religion just got a whole heck of a lot more complicated in the past like 50 years. It is no longer these simple, verifiable, eternal truths that have like endured through the ages, unchallenged, unquestioned. Now religion is a violent, ugly business. It is passionate. It is the stuff of violence and anger and killing. And these artists are very attentive to it. And you can also see this chiaroscuro effect, this light and dark play in Tintoretto's The Last Supper. And this makes an especially good contrast against Da Vinci's Last Supper, which you'll remember, Da Vinci's Last Supper, like the table is perpendicular to the viewer. Like you can see all of the faces, all of the disciples evenly. They're all lit with that typical even lighting, even though it doesn't make sense in that scene, because clearly the most bright place in the painting is in the back. So theoretically, everybody should be backlit. By contrast, notice how, again, Tintoretto is defying space here. The lamp up at the top left corner seems to be the brightest thing in the room, and yet it's kind of hard to place it compared to the rest of the scene. It seems like the scene trails into the background, that the lamp is in the foreground, and that would make sense because the light itself, it is showing us the front of a lot of the disciples' faces, but it disappears quickly when you get to the back. You can also see that Tintoretto is focusing a lot on the shadow here, like the washerwoman, the shadow covering her face because she's turned away from the light. You can see a lot of the disciples casting shadows over the table here. Only Jesus, again, is at the center of the work. He is, once again, like the bright center. He is himself apparently a source of light. But you can also see that, like, he is, bending down. He is also obscured for the most part. He is not the center of the painting. And in fact, if you follow the sight lines, it's all over the freaking place. Like, you've got the light from the torch that is just radiating outwards. You've got all the disciples just like staring in random weird directions. You've got, the serving woman down here staring at the thing that she's holding, and the guy staring at her, and this guy's staring at this, and there's a cat. Like, what is even happening in here? It is no longer simple or straightforward. You can also see that all of those supernatural elements, they're back. Like, all of the angels that we would see in medieval literature and art are now hanging around the periphery. Like, there seem to be angels in the light of the room. You can see these random angels coming out of the ceiling here. Like, the supernatural elements are back with a vengeance. They are now crowding around the periphery of these paintings, where the Renaissance would have relegated them to the sides, if at all. That interest in naturalism is just gone. Now, this is late Mannerism, so this is like Mannerism in its full flower, complete with distorted spaces and darkness and light and chiaroscuro and violent poses and distorted figures and supernatural elements. This is even more Mannerist in many ways than a lot of the paintings we've looked at before. Importantly, though, Mannerism is going to give way to two radically different movements, pretty much divided on Catholic Protestant lines. Ultimately, they're all going to seep into the Baroque. Like, we're going to just see different ways that the Baroque is manifested. But you're going to see this sort of divergence in emphasis as time goes on. So increasingly, as Protestants decide that they're not going to spend a whole heck of a lot of money on all this opulent artwork and architecture the way that the Catholics did, because they're Protestants and they don't cop to that crap. You're going to see instead a whole bunch of relatively wealthy secular forces in the Protestant world commissioning artwork that has like nothing to do with religion or myth or pagan ideals. You're going to see peaceful pastoral scenes like this painting by Peter Bruegel the Elder, where it's just a giant pile of peasants doing peasant stuff, rolling hoops and doing business and flipping around on carts, I guess, like building stuff and hanging out and just being normal. This is going to be increasingly prevalent in the Protestant world. They are going to increasingly focus on these sort of secular pastoral scenes. And by contrast, the Catholics are going to go super Catholic. Like, where they had once all of the major artworks had been devoted to, Jesus and Mary and all of the major players in the New Testament and the biblical tradition. Now we're going to be celebrating all those crazy Catholic saints that the Protestants hate because we're Catholic and we're not bound to this Protestant shit. So here we have the burial of Count Orgaz and just like all of the Catholic finery on display. Here's the Pope, here's the crozier, like here's all the angels and all the Catholic saints in heaven awaiting the soul of Count Orgaz. Like, let's just throw ourselves 100% into this super Spanish, super Catholic. Here's Peter with the keys. Like, it's just, if any Protestant sees this, their head is going to explode. Like, that's the idea. The Catholics are now hardcore Catholic. The Protestants are now hardcore Protestant because they do not have any truck with each other in the wake of the Reformation. Now, the one last thing I want to talk about before we call it a day, and I know this one's probably run long, this one always runs long, I want to talk about why exactly we're doing humanities in here, like what exactly the business is that we're doing. And I want to stress this because, it's easy to sort of like get bound up in all of this memorization and all of these movements and forget like why it's important that people are studying this stuff. Like why do we need academic professors? So let me tell you a story about this painting, The Last Supper by Da Vinci. Like obviously it's one of the most famous paintings in the world. You've probably seen it like many times before, but it's got a story attached to it. See, in 1498, Leonardo da Vinci finished The Last Supper. But Leonardo da Vinci was a creative dude. He was frequently, playing around with his materials and frequently did not stick with, just normal canvas or normal frescoes. So when he painted The Last Supper, he painted it on drywall and then put the drywall up in front of the actual wall of the place where he had built it, this little, like, scholar's nook or something. And for anyone who knows anything about painting materials, this is not a terribly reliable way to do painting. Like, an actual fresco is like, it's painted on stone, and it uses materials that are likely to survive on stone for a long period of time. But here's Da Vinci playing around with these new techniques, and it quickly starts to deteriorate. So by 1517, you've got people complaining that the painting is flaking. Apparently, because there's space between the drywall and the actual stone wall of the building, there's all this moisture that's collecting on the inside of the drywall and the inside of the stone that like nobody can do anything about because it's behind the wall, and the moisture, the condensation, is causing the paint to deteriorate faster than it normally would. So the paint is flaking off. And by 1532, numerous people who are seeing the painting have mentioned that it is blurred, that it is colorless, that all of the colors have faded off the painting, that the figures are no longer easy to distinguish. It's a giant mess. And by 1556, there are commentators who go so far as to say that it's just a lost cause. It's ruined. Within 60 years, the painting is effectively destroyed. Now, because it looks like garbage at this point, people stop taking it seriously. So in 1652, somebody's remodeling this particular building, and they cut a door through the bottom of the painting, like where Jesus' feet are and the table legs. There's now a door there. There's this giant hole in the painting. And finally, after they build the door, they decide that they're not going to actually go forward with those renovations, and the building is condemned, and the whole thing is bricked up, which, shocker, means there's another layer of moisture that gets to collect on the front side of the painting behind the bricks. So the whole thing is a giant mess. By the 18th century, in 1768, they rediscover the painting, they open up the building, they're trying to protect it, and they protect it by hanging a curtain over it in order to protect it. So it's not vulnerable to, the elements all the time. But it's a curtain, so every time they draw the curtain, it scrapes away parts of the painting because, again, the painting is flaking. That's the whole thing that has been such a problem to this point. Additionally, again, it's a curtain, so it traps moisture, and once again, we have the painting covered in moisture, and it's just causing it to flake even faster. So now every time that you draw the curtain, just more and more of the painting is just falling off. Now, an effort to restore it has actually been undertaken at this point. In 1726, a painter named Bellotti attempted to restore it by using oil paint and varnish, even though those are not even a little bit the right like materials for it. In 1770, a guy named Mazka attempts to do the same thing. He attempts to like restore the painting, bring it back out. But then it's 1796, and the French Revolution strikes, and all of the French soldiers sweep through Italy, and they find this painting, and because they are antagonistic to everything that is religious, all religious iconography, all religious artwork, they systematically scratch out the eyes of all of the apostles and of Jesus. They throw rocks at the painting for fun, and finally they like brick up the place and keep prisoners in here with the painting who do God only knows what to this, revered work of Da Vinci's art. Later in 1821, everybody realizes, oh my God, this is a Da Vinci. Maybe we should actually do something about this. And a new artist named Barkzy tries to remove the painting, but he thinks it's a fresco. He thinks it's like literally painted on the stone. So he proceeds to like rip off an entire quarter of the painting before he realizes that it's not a fresco. It's on friggin' drywall. And this is going to be a completely different job. So he, just destroys it all the more and tries to like glue it back on. Then, just to add insult to injury, in 1943, the building is bombed by the Allies as they were sweeping through Europe in World War II. Fortunately, the building was protected by the painting part was protected by sandbags, so it didn't like destroy the wall. But just in case you thought like all of the scratching out and the curtain was bad, like let's just bomb the shit out of the painting while we're at it. Finally, this is what we're left with. Like, this is the painting as it existed in the 1970s when an effort to restore it was underway. It is a giant mess. And the painting that the painting that you are familiar with, the painting that I showed you a moment ago, is kind of bullshit. We don't know what Da Vinci's original intention was, or what colors he had on the canvas, or what even the figures looked like. This is the product of, 4 different attempts at restoration, all of the destruction that has taken place at various times, all of the paint that is flaked off multiple times at this point. You can see the friggin' door cut in the middle of the painting. Like, this is what happens when you don't pay attention to what you've got. Like, artwork deteriorates. And this is not just, an old school problem. Like, I know we all have the internet now, and it's like, well, that's ridiculous. Now we've got a digital copy, and it's perfect, and we'll never lose anything again. So much of history has lost so much artwork. Art is one thing. Like, obviously, when a painter makes a painting, there's only one. And it's like, you either take care of it or it's gone. And there are lots of artworks that have been lost to the centuries, either because of the French Revolution, like destroying religious artwork, or when Charles V swept into Rome, he melted down a bunch of Da Vinci's statues to make cannons out of them. This is pretty common practice. But what's more, like, old Hollywood has lost tons of their old movies and fires and riots and scandals and God only knows. Even today, like video games especially, what with all of the new technological developments, like a lot of the old games from the old like 80s computer games and stuff like that are just lost, or there's no way to port them to contemporary technology. Never mind the fact that it's only a matter of time until like the first NESs stop working. The first games that were made for them, like the ones that don't get reprinted every time Nintendo starts, wanting more money, like they're going to deteriorate and disappear as well, and there's no way for us to protect and preserve them. See, this is what humanities is all about. Humanities is about recognizing the value of works of art like this, of works of media, works that have changed the world in one way or another, and as much as we can, protecting and preserving them. So what I'm going to ask you to do in this class, because I know there's a ton of reading and there's a ton of stuff to learn, there's a ton of art that we're going to talk about. It's overwhelming a lot of the time, and a lot of it's going to be boring, and you're going to hate a lot of it, and that's okay. Like, there are a lot of these works that I don't care for all that much. Like, when we get to Shaw, I'm going to be so mad at Shaw all the time. But I also recognize, and I want you to recognize as well, that people care about this stuff. It was important at one time, maybe even now. If it's important enough that it made it to my class, if I thought it was important enough to share with you when we are running at this breakneck pace through all of art and literature through 500 years, then it's really important to other people as well. I encourage you to find out why. Like, read this stuff, look at these artworks, study this stuff, and ask yourself, what was it that drew all these people to this thing? Because if we don't protect it, if we don't recognize the value in these things, we will lose them. They'll eventually disappear. They'll be gone. And there are tons of cultural forces out there that are eager to destroy them for one reason or another, often in good intentions. The French Revolution had perfectly good intentions when it was like, religion is trapping us, and the Pope is making our lives miserable. Let's destroy Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper. The thinking was good-ish, like it was motivated by altruistic intentions, but it was still at the end of the day destruction. You can't go back from that. And there's a lot of that happening. Like just in the past couple of years, think of Notre Dame Cathedral, the fire that burned down the whole ceiling, and now nobody's sure if they can restore it or not. We don't get another shot at that. When it's gone, it's gone. So keep this in mind. Like, remain respectful of the works that we are dealing with in this class, because a lot of them have changed a lot of people's minds, and they might change yours if you give them half a chance. So have patience and have a little sympathy. For next time, we will talk about one of those works that lots of people hate, namely Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus. And honestly, this one is tough, I admit that. The great advantage of this class is the farther we get into the future, the closer we get to the present, the easier the readings are going to get, which is kind of nice. But this one's rough. It's old 16th and 17th century English poetry. It can rile and be a bit of a trial. But I also find that a lot of students really like the story. It's a good time, as much as it's a rough thing to get through. So give it a chance. See if you can find why all these people care about this book and why all these people found this play moving as much as they did. And we'll talk about it next time. So thank you for bearing with me, and I know this was a long one. Hopefully in the future they won't run quite as long. In the meantime, enjoy Christopher Marlowe and maybe think about, all those great works of art that you've been neglecting for all this time.